Hey guys, sorry about the slightly late start there, but let's see. So probably going to keep this relatively. Yes, please, by all means, like and subscribe. Nope, there is nothing wrong with your clock. That's why I said sorry about the late start, which I am. Just finished making a a pecan pie for tomorrow. And just took a little longer than I thought it would, but I'm here now. Probably gonna be sticking around for about an hour. So hit me up with questions. Since um, obviously super chats go to the front of the line, but but I am hi Andy. But I am going to try to get to as many questions of all types as I possibly can. And let's see. Should plug before I do that. Before I start taking questions. So there's going to be an article that I wrote for Jacobin that's it's going to come out tomorrow. If you are I'm going to do anything they ask me to for left reckoning. I mean, obviously, Matt and David are friends of mine, and and I want their show to be successful, and so whatever they end up asking me to do, I'll do. Whether it's just come on as a guest every now and again, or whatever that ends up looking like. But it should be a great show. I'm a patron. Managed to sneak in there. Right at the beginning, become the first patron. You should be a patron too. Not, I mean, if you've only got $5 a month to spare, be a patron, give them an argument. But if you've got 10, for sure, do left reckoning also. So tomorrow is an article of mine that's coming out in Jacobin, which is which is going to be my obituary for Judith Jarvis Thompson, who died last week, and is somebody I really see as as an important model for how to do this kind of public philosophy, how to make arguments to debunk the right. Right, even though she wasn't a socialist as far as I know, but her classic defense of abortion rights, I think, is something that tons of people have read. I think it's actually the most anthologized article in all of contemporary, 20th century philosophy. Certainly the most anthologized ethics article, by a mile. And I think it's a really good model for how to balance analytic rigor with clarity. She was just a ridiculously good writer, and somebody who, she was never flowery or pretentious in her writing. She was incredibly clear and direct, but in a way where you can tell she put an enormous amount of effort into it. I read Claudia Mills in her introduction. It's on the Daily News obituary post for Thompson. Quotes, talks about when Thompson was her undergrad professor. She went to Wellesley and Thompson taught at MIT, but there was an exchange thing where she could take some classes at MIT. And Thompson was both incredibly supportive, especially for her as a young female philosopher, when philosophy, in the 1970s, is even more male dominated than it is now, which is really saying something. And also somebody who really helped her improve her writing, right? Like I quote this in the article. She talks about how overjoyed she was when she finally wrote a sentence that Thompson liked. But yeah, I think that because she's such a good writer and she's so clear and direct, I think it really showed that you can do this kind of politically engaged public work. Like that essay, A Defense of Abortion, anybody who reads can read that essay. It doesn't reference any sort of esoteric, philosophical anything that you might not know. But it still manages to be incredibly rigorous in following all the arguments and counter arguments and objections and responses. So yeah, I mean, I think I try to give her in the obituary due for the trolley problem. This is an incredibly nerdy and nitpicky point, but I hate it when people say that Philippa Foot gave us the trolley problem. Philippa Foot threw out a example about a runaway trolley as one of like 100 examples in a paper that was about something else, and she thought it was obvious what to do about it. The problem is what Thompson introduced. So anyway, you can read that tomorrow in Jacobin. I should also plug this weekend. Recording this weekend, coming out as always, right? Recording live for patrons as always, and coming out on YouTube at 7:30 on Monday night as always. The next episode is going to be really good. It is going to be Rob Larson, the in-house economist from Current Affairs, who wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom, Capitalism and Unfreedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom, which is a play on the titles of two famous libertarian books. Of course, there's Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. Sally Hasslinger. That might be an interesting conversation. That's worth thinking about. Hi, Christian. It's gonna be Rob Larson, talking about capitalism and unfreedom, and it's all thematically, tightly related. It's not like, I loved both halves of that episode last week, debating Walter Block and chatting about gangster movies with Mike Racine. But, there's a reason we put it that way in the title, because after done, I was like, oh, wow, this is really kind of disjointed, right? Like these two things don't really fit together. But this is all going to fit together pretty tightly since it's Rob Larson, and it's also going into a long planned panel discussion. This is actually something I had planned way back when I was co-hosting Dead Pundit Society before I resurrected and became a living pundit, which is Alex Gurvich, who is a historian who I interviewed, a couple months ago for the Jacobin YouTube channel. Walter Block thought Kamala Harris was to the left of Bernie and AOC. I don't understand how somebody who said, he says he started on the left. I don't understand how he can possibly believe that. But anyway, Alex Gurvich, he was the guy I interviewed on the Jacobin YouTube channel a couple months ago about the Knights of Labor, that sort of early socialist labor organizing. Hi, Andy. And Matt Karp is a Jacobin contributing editor, and he's written a lot about the early Republican Party and that kind of anti-slavery agitation. And the common thread for all three guests, Alex Gurvich, Matt Karp, Rob Larson, is going to be what's sometimes called the Republican theory of freedom, or Republican theory of liberty, small r Republican. That's cool. Jeremy Salmon, by the way, shout out, host of the Give Them an Argument podcast. Oh, sorry, that would be me. The Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person podcast, which is good stuff. I've been on there a couple times. Says, ask Rob Larson about being at the only big Bernie rally in the Pacific Northwest this year back in February. He was sitting like 10 rows in front of me. That's cool. I understand the metric I understand the metric people are using to make that claim that Kamala is to the left of Bernie, but I think the second you start looking at the methodology, it falls apart. It just doesn't make any sense. So what they do use to measure, how liberal you are, which is of course the first problem, because Bernie isn't a liberal, which is a good thing. He's a left-wing, social democrat. But what they use to measure how liberal you are, or how conservative you are if you're a Republican, is how many of your votes are straight party line votes versus votes with co-sponsors from the other party. But I did a video about this. Actually, I think this was my very first quick take on Jacobin's YouTube. It's total BS for a metric because if you actually start thinking about this, well, hold on. So if Kamala Harris votes for some meaningless procedural thing that, the Democrats are trying to do one maneuver and the Republicans are trying to do another. So she votes for some, meaningless procedural thing that has no Republican co-sponsors because it's a matter of parliamentary maneuvering between the two parties. That somehow makes her more liberal. And if Bernie Sanders find some Republican co-sponsors for a bill to expand the number of VA hospitals, then that makes him less liberal. It's silly. It's meaningless. Especially because if you think about it, if you're somebody like Bernie Sanders who's actually trying to bring new policy ideas that aren't part of the mainstream conversation and get people to take them seriously, or even do these little things like expanding community health clinics and get people to take that seriously, then of course you're going to look for a Republican co-sponsor every time you can to try to anytime anything Bernie can do, he can get a Republican co-sponsor for. He's going to try to do that to get people to take him more seriously because he needs that, right? As an independent, as somebody who's to the left of the mainstream of the Democratic Party, of just about anybody except for the squad. Whereas if you're somebody like Kamala Harris, you're a blue state senator with no particular, political agenda of your own and no particular ambitions except for to serve time, don't cause any waves, get all the right people to like you and build up your resume so you can, well, in her case, become vice president, then of course you just go along with whatever the party bosses said about every issue. And yeah, it's unsurprising that you end up voting for 99% things that are just straight party line one way or the other. So total nonsense. Looks like there are a few questions. See some that are more concretely political and some that are about philosophy and stuff. So let me work backwards from the concretely political ones. 255 AD says, suppose the Democrats got Medicare for all passed in the 60s or 70s. Do you think it would have survived Reagan? Yeah, I do. And my reason for thinking that is that the NHS survived Thatcher. Not unscathed, but it did survive. And for that matter, Canadian Medicare has survived conservative prime ministers, including like Stephen Harper, who was basically the Canadian proto-Trump. People were comparing him to Bush, but I think he was actually more like Trump. So yeah, and I think there's a structural reason why, if Medicare for all had been passed in like the early 70s, say, or let's say 1970, Medicare for all had happened in 1970. And, there's an alternate timeline where that might have happened. Remember the Johnson administration in the mid 60s, rolled out Medicare, but according to some former Johnson administration officials, the plan was that the next step after Medicare for seniors was going to be like kid care. There was going to be a Medicare-like socialized insurance program for young people, for, I don't know, people 25 and younger, or something like that. And if that had happened, who knows, right? Maybe like the third step would have been just like, hey, if you're in between 25 and 65, now you get Medicare. And the reason that didn't happen was basically Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a huge money sink. It was a huge political sink. It took up all the attention and oxygen. And so there's a lesson here, which is, kids, if you want your, if you want, you've got to eat your anti-imperialist meat if you want your social democratic pudding at home. And conversely, right, I've always thought that one of the best ways that we could undermine empire is by fighting for massive social programs in order to force guns versus butter trade-offs, because it's very hard to convince Americans that they should care about, some kid in Pakistan who gets killed by a drone strike. Most people just don't want to think about that. Whereas it's much easier to say, hey, if we didn't spend all this money on having this massive overseas empire, look at all this stuff we could do at home. So let's see, what were some earlier questions? The Pennsylvania, the judge that just halted the election certification. This I don't know, but I will say, I suspect this might have happened while I was making the pecan pie earlier. But let me just say this in general. Even Laura Ingraham has been trying to break it to her viewers on Fox that Donald Trump is not going to discover one neat trick to let himself become, stay president for the next 4 years. She's trying to get people used to this. And that should tell you something, right? Because she's one of the most, Trumpy Fox hosts. So I think that whatever happens with any remaining, look, Trump basically gave up the pretense that even he thought that he was going to stay president when he gave the okay to the general, Emily at the General Services Administration to try to start the official transition. Right? I mean, yeah, technically speaking, it's possible that the thing is, even Pennsylvania, even if something did happen in Pennsylvania that actually and nothing's going to happen in Pennsylvania that's going to put it in the Trump column. I just don't believe that. But even if something did happen that was going to put Pennsylvania in the Trump column, who cares? He can win without it. Biden wins without it, right? Biden did win with it, but he'd also win without it. So I really don't. I mean, I think I made a pretty conscious decision pretty early on that I wasn't going to do a ton of content about the breathless, up to the minute, blow by blow of all of the legal battles and the state legislature maneuvering and all that stuff, because I just didn't believe it, right? I didn't want to be dishonest to you guys, frankly, by presenting it as something that actually might happen, that you should lose any sleep over, or frankly that you should let yourself be distracted from critiquing Biden by. I voted for Biden in my swing state. I used all my platforms to urge other people to do the same thing, but but I always thought, then the day after Biden wins, you pivot to exclusively focusing on his god-awful neoliberal incoming administration. And I think this whole thing is just kind of a farcical, distraction from that. I don't, I don't think we should take it particularly seriously. I mean, if Trump took it seriously, he wouldn't have had Giuliani and these other barely alive clowns running the show. I mean, I really liked Vanessa B's comment on Twitter that having Giuliani run the election efforts was like making plans with your flakiest friend. You can say that you're trying, but that your ass is staying at home. Yeah, I don't think Plato was exactly a fascist, but I know what you mean when you say that. So if you read Plato's Republic, it's very it's very authoritarian, right? Like in a strange sort of way, it almost sounds like he's describing, I don't know, this philosophical version of Iran under the Ayatollahs or something like that. He says that people, poets, and especially, the way he divides up the categories, people who write plays are a kind of poet, right? But the tragic poets, especially the people who are writing tragedies, shouldn't be allowed in an ideal city because these stir up dangerous emotions. In fact, the only poets you should allow are ones who write hymns to the gods or panegyrics to the good. So again, I know what you mean when you say fascist. I think it's a very authoritarian vision in a lot of ways. Doesn't mean you shouldn't read Plato or appreciate his many brilliant arguments about many subjects. You should. But obviously it's not, I know some people like Kautsky even, I think, and I'm people probably know, right? I'm exactly the kind of Jacobin asshole who really likes Kautsky in a lot of ways, but Kautsky even did this thing of trying to assimilate, Plato's Republic, that vision, into some sort of proto-socialist thing, but I think that's just wrong. I think it's a very elitist and authoritarian conception, which they're it's bad, right? But it's not fascist. Fascist has a specific historical meaning that I agree with whoever it was in the chat who said that nothing, pre-capitalism, really counts as fascist, and even within capitalism, right? I think we should be much more specific about that term. Watch the stream that I did with Daniel Bessner about this. Basically, at least the way I use the term fascism, and I think honestly it's the most the least sloppy way to use it, is influenced by the way that people like Leon Trotsky or Clara Zetkin, these like early 20th century Marxist critics who talked about fascism, the way they analyzed it, which is that fascism is basically what fascism is, or these kind of grassroots street fighting mass movements like the brown shirts or the black shirts or, etc., who are basically used both before they come into power when they're just doing things like burning down union halls and beating up communists in back alleys, and after they come to power, when they smash parliamentary democracy and partially supplement the state with these, again, street fighting kind of gangsterish elements. The fascism is a hammer that's used by the capitalist class when it feels like it's in danger of losing the whole store in a workers' revolution, to completely smash the political organizations of the working class and the labor unions and all of that stuff. And so I think it's a much more specific thing than just authoritarian nationalism. That would be my argument. And I don't think that anything is gained when we just throw that around like it means nothing. I mean, I'm sure I've done that too, right? I've used fascist as a pejorative without really, meaning a lot by it, except like super right wing and authoritarian people who suck. But I think we should probably be more careful about it. Dad at Bestiny, thank you so much, brother, for the super chat. Says, do you think atheism, lowercase atheism maybe, has any value to the left at all? Sort of. So I'm in a little bit of a weird position about this one, because I am an atheist, right? A lowercase a atheist, as you say, which is an important distinction, and maybe we can talk about what that means in a second. And also I'm a philosophy nerd, so I enjoy like arguing about, debating all the arguments for and against the existence of God, and I obviously have my own views on that. But I've also been a little hesitant to do things like on modern day debate, right? Which is where I debated that Mr. Reagan guy a couple times, and that pro-life activist Kay Fellows. Modern day debate, they do lots of religion debates there, and I've had the thought every once in a while, oh yeah, that would be really fun, right? Go on there and do like an old fashioned, like Christopher Hitchens style atheism debate, because again, I'm a philosophy nerd. I like thinking about this stuff. I have very strong views about what the what the right takeaway is from these arguments. But I'm a little hesitant to do it just because I don't want to give anybody the idea that I think that atheism is a component of any sort of like political program that I had. Like if I did it, I would have to try to find some way of making it clear that like, look, this is just for fun. This is because I like thinking about philosophy. I don't think you have to, be an atheist to be a good leftist. I don't think that like convincing everybody of atheism is part of some sort of left project. Because I don't, right? I agree with my late friend Michael Brooks. What he lays out in Jeremy says, Ben, there's no effing way you could ever get as hammered as Hitchens could get, especially before arguing on stage. That might very well be true. Although, hey, got some Johnny Walker Black Label, which is what he drank. But I think that, but like I said, I think the approach that Michael takes in his book Against the Web, I think is the right way to think about it, right? So it's not like there are obviously some universal principles about pluralism and democracy, human rights, all that good stuff that we do need to insist on. But I think you can find those. I think you can find support for those principles within any major cultural tradition. Right. By which I mean something pretty specific, right? That like that you can find, like the same way that when people in like Singapore or wherever, talk about Asian values as an excuse for authoritarianism, we should roll our eyes and point out that there are plenty of supports that you could give in like the Buddhist tradition, for example, for human rights and respecting pluralism and all of that stuff. And obviously, Christianity. I mean, look, Cornel West is one of the people I admire most in the world, and he is, among other things, a Christian theologian, and for sure, Islam, etc. And I think that even if in some of these traditions the dominant strands have been very like reactionary, authoritarian, that doesn't mean there are other strands. And I think that if you say, oh, we have to convince people to just give up their deeply held views about the universe and community and how they see themselves in relation to those two things in order to sign on to our political project, I think that's just a losing proposition. I think that of course, religious pluralism, freedom of religion, which means crucially freedom of irreligion, all of those things are absolutely crucial. But I think that saying, as in fact some like historical communist movements mostly have, that you need to reject religion in order to be fully one of us, really embrace our political program, I think is a huge strategic mistake. That said, I am an atheist, right? I do think that like thinking about like the problem of evil, if there's a all-powerful and all good, there's a supremely powerful being who's also morally good, how the hell do you explain all the stuff that actually happens? I actually do think that argument gives us really powerful evidence that there isn't any such being. That's my view. I don't see that as part of my political agenda. I just think that, that's my view about the world. So again, I think that all the arguments for the existence of God are super unconvincing. I think that all of the theistic defenses against the problem of evil are super unconvincing. I think the problem of evil is like a good evidential problem of evil is a good argument. It doesn't give us absolute certainty that God doesn't exist, but I mean, good luck having absolute certainty about anything like that. I mean, you could be a non-classical theist, right? Like you could just think, oh, God isn't all powerful, be a Gnostic or something, like HG points out. But of course, that's not usually what people are arguing for in these arguments. Zizek, I think, has some interesting things to say about this stuff. That is an interesting all caps comment. Alrighty then. You seem like a very unhappy person. I'm going to leave it at that. So in any case, right? So that's my view. I'm an atheist, but I'm not a political atheist, right? In the sense of thinking that, there's some sort of great political crusade we need to be on, like what Hitchens thought at the end of his life, to convince everybody to be an atheist, that this is like a necessary condition for human emancipation. Because I honestly just don't think that that's right. And I don't really like capital A atheism, which is what I really associate with the by which I mean like the early 2000s kind of new atheist view, that like they sort of treated atheism as if there should be a capital A there, as if atheism was a worldview in itself. Like Richard Dawkins even like started wearing around like a pin with a capital A on it, like the equivalent of like a crucifix pin or something. Thought like that's just kind of silly, right? Like the fact that I don't believe that there are any gods does not actually mean that I have that I feel more akin to, or I have more of a comprehensive worldview in common with Richard Dawkins than I do with, like, say, Cornel West or like Rabbi Michael Lerner, who's a humanistic socialist, left-wing rabbi. Well, with Dawkins, it doesn't stand for anarchist. There's a super chat earlier. Thank you so much, Yoda7104, for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Yoda says, watch Brianna Joy Gray on Katie Halper talking about how the movement could use a more coherent argument, even if we have to be willing to do talking points. Any thoughts about a more organized argument? Yeah, I think I know what you mean. And if so, I think I agree with Bree's point there. Hold on a second. My dog's scratching at the door. So, yeah, which is to say that I think that we need to. Yeah. Oh God, Sam Harris, Jesus Christ. That's Sam Harris, right? I mean, like the combination of the reactionary politics and the abject philosophical illiteracy, but insistence on talking about subjects he doesn't understand. Yes, I would like to think I have 1,000 times more in common with like some, Christian socialist who, believes in religious pluralism and religious freedom than I do with somebody like Sam Harris. Yes, that's why we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore. Watch that, his debate with Ezra Klein. Yeah, well, Sam Harris, I think it's mostly just he has an incredibly, soothing and calm voice. That's like 95% of his shtick right there. But yeah, so I never really completely answered Yoda's question, but I think I agree with Bree's point on this, which is basically just the left needs to be better at kind of message discipline, basically, which I think is right. Like something I've thought about a lot with this is that, okay, like if you just ask somebody on the street, like somebody who pays a little bit of attention to politics, who knows who Bernie Sanders is, who knows who AOC is, but, isn't like some obsessive, like probably everybody watching this is, like I certainly am. And you ask, okay, what does the left want? Right? Well, they probably know that we want Medicare for all, which is great because it's a very popular issue. It plays really well with us. They might know that we want something called the Green New Deal, although there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what that means. Look, even in his later years when he had terrible foreign policy positions, Christopher Hitchens, was let's put it this way, Sam Harris is somebody who, if not for the fact that Hitchens made the mistake of associating with him, is somebody who doesn't even belong in the same conversation as Christopher Hitchens. Yeah, exactly. Oliver Adelson says Sam Harris talking about Hume is like the arrogant kid in class giving a presentation on a book he didn't read. Exactly right. So yeah, people know that we want Medicare for all. They know that we want a Green New Deal, although there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Green New Deal means. I think we'd be way better off if we emphasized about 1,000 times more than we do a universal jobs guarantee. I think if we got to the point where everybody on the street who pays a little bit of attention to politics, knows who Bernie is, knows AOC is, basically anybody who pays enough attention to know that the left wants Medicare for all, if they also knew that we wanted the government to give everybody a public sector job, at least as a employer of last resort, then then I think we'd be much better off. So I think I agree with Bree. Right? We need to be better about being on message when it comes to stuff like that. Yeah, Kyle Ferguson. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know where you're getting this idea that I want to trans people to beat up cis women or whatever you're going on about, but no. Just calm down and just know, right? I support equal rights and equality for trans people, but I don't want to beat anybody up. I literally don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, yeah, I agree. Just gonna put the user in timeout here. I agree that a jobs program is better than UBI. I think that UBI might be a component of like a well-functioning post-capitalist society. But I think as far as what we're like demanding as reform right now, I think UBI is better. And I think it makes more strategic sense. Like I think it's something people understand better. I think it's something that is less easy to be co-opted for libertarian, Silicon Valley, ghouls to co-opt and have their own interpretation of. And I think it makes more strategic sense because right now, workers' greatest power to change the system is at the workplace, right? We don't want, so I think that should be, obviously, I think a long-term goal of socialism should be to decrease the amount of time everybody has to spend at work. We can all spend more of our time, thinking about philosophy and, climbing mountains or whatever the hell you want to do with your life, projects of your own choosing. But I think that right now, I think what we need is a universal jobs program. 100% agree. Kikyo Sugaku, thank you so much for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Says, what is a good start for someone new to philosophy? Well, I think that it depends, what kind of philosophy you're interested in, which I know is kind of a uninformative answer, but let me see if I can make that a little bit more informative and try to make it a little bit more concrete. So I think that if you're interested in ethics, right? I started the stream by talking about Jews, Janice Thompson. I think stuff like her paper on abortion or her paper Killing, Letting Die, and the trolley problem, I think are super accessible, but also extremely logically rigorous, really good starting places for thinking about stuff like that. I think that if you're interested, I think if you're interested in epistemology and philosophy of mind and stuff like that, a pretty good accessible introduction that also covers a lot of interest in historical philosophy, Descartes and stuff like that, is Simon Blackburn has a book that's just called Think. So I might check that out. If you're interested in sort of fun, kind of much more abstract and esoteric, but to me at least really interested in metaphysical issues, there's a book it's in dialogue form. It's co-written by Quentin Smith and Nathan Oaklander. I hope I'm getting that second name right. First one I'm sure of. He was my professor at Western Michigan, called Time, Change, and Freedom. If you're interested in sort of philosophical issues about logic, there's a book by Graham Priest called Logic, A Very Brief Insight. If you want to just read some historical philosophy that's accessible and interesting, obviously I know that this is kind of hilariously predictable coming from me, right? Because I'm always bringing the guy up, but I think David Hume, if you go to, actually, I would plug this website called Early Modern Texts, TEXTS, Early Modern Texts, earlymoderntext.com, I think. Might be getting that wrong, but so it's earlymoderntext.com that has nice very accessible versions of a lot of historical philosophical texts, very clear translations, if you've got an unlimited amount of time, go back to Thales, but in there, and even things that are written in English, they'll update really anachronistic and weird word choices and stuff, and always indicate when they do it. So early modern texts, the Hume thing you might be thinking of is the essay concerning human understanding, or maybe the treatise on human nature. But the Hume, which are great, right? But I mean, that's not what I'd start with, right? What I'd start with is there's a little thin Hume book, or whatever. You can just read the individual essays on this website, called 4 Essays, where it's Hume at his most fun. There's this one called On Heaven and Hell, with all his arguments against the idea of an afterlife. There's one called On Suicide, where he's challenging the idea that suicide is immoral because our life belongs to God, stuff like that. And I think if you want just a little flavor of interest in philosophy, that would not be a terrible place to start at all. If you want to, if you're interested in Marxist philosophy, then of course, if you want to read Marx himself, you want to get a sense of his theory of history, I think the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon is a great place to start for that. Or if you want to get the Or if you want to get like this sort of like really direct political things from Mark and very easy to read, accessible forums, I think some of his addresses to the First International, you can find all that stuff for free on the Marxist Internet Archive. That's marxist.org. And if you want like really good secondary stuff on Marxist philosophy, I'm obviously going to recommend my boy G.A. Cohen, who like his book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, is really good for breaking down. Actually, the first chapter, breaking down even Hegel into easy to understand arguments, which is a hell of an accomplishment, and doing the same thing for Marx and the rest. And I'd also really recommend Cohen's book, Self-Ownership, Freedom, and Equality, which is a really good, like, that's Cohen arguing with libertarians. So that's great stuff. And yeah, actually those like graphic, like those like weird little graphic novel, like Philosopher X for Beginners things. Some of those are actually like, yeah, I read plenty of those back in the day. Those are a lot of fun and they're interesting. And yeah, you can do a lot worse. Like I remember the Sartre for Beginners one, being really, being really good. Yeah, most philosophers were shitty writers. That's why I try to praise the ones who weren't, like Hume or Judith Jarvis Thompson. So let's see. I know I missed a bunch of questions. Oh yeah, Oliver asked which philosophers had the best, worst writing style. Yeah, so I think I think Hume is entertaining to read. Nietzsche obviously is somebody who like just as prose. I mean, there's a reason he's one of very few important historical philosophers who laymen actually read for pleasure. Plato, right, to go back to earlier, right, is a very entertaining writer. I think that God, I mean, trying to list off all of the philosophers who are terrible writers, that would just be, I'd just do that for the rest of the stream. It'd be very boring. But there are a ton of them. Andrew Rex wrote, thank you so much for the super chat, brother. Thoughts on the left pushing for a constitutional right to strike? People like Jane McKelvey have been talking about, easy to understand immediately. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I mean, I wish I had more in-depth thoughts, but yes, is my thought about that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Jesse asked earlier, and I meant to go back to it. Thoughts on a maximum wage paired with minimum wage or UBI? Helpful, not helpful? Yeah. I mean, when my friend David McReynolds, my late friend David McReynolds was running for president on the Socialist Party ticket, this was one of the things he was talking about, having like a maximum wage, basically just as a way of flattening wage scales within firms, that you'd have make it illegal to pay the CEO more than like X times the amount that you pay the lowest paid worker. And yeah, absolutely. By the way, there's a really good article by Connor Kilpatrick, whose name the name of the article, unfortunately, I'm blanking out on, but it's from Jacobin. It's from right after Bernie dropped out, where he talks about David McReynolds' run for president in 2000. And he talks about McReynolds' appearance on the Bill Maher show when he was running for president, and how basically in a lot of ways this was like proto Bernie, right? This was this like cool old man who's like talking about the achievements of Nordic social democracy and pushing this economic leftism and Medicare for all and all this stuff. And at the time, like Bill Maher and Joe Rogan, I think, was on there, and Rogan was like, "This is the craziest shit I've ever heard. What's wrong with you?" And of course, Rogan was actually supporting Bernie Sanders this time around, so really, tells you something about how much more seriously those ideas are taken now. Oh, that's interesting. Erican says there's a philosopher named Gregory Moss coming out with a book called Hegel's Foundation Free Logic. It's about paraconsistent logic and Hegel's logic. That's interesting. I'll check that out. I'm a little skeptical. Paraconsistent logic, for anybody who doesn't, I remember I had a friend in grad school once who, how I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to do my dissertation on something related to paraconsistent logic. And he was like, man, that, really thick North Carolina accent. It's like, man, that sounds like, paraconsistent logic. That sounds like math mixed with the Ghostbusters. But paraconsistent logic is a kind of non-classical logic where you can have logical inconsistency without just everything following from that. And I'm a little bit skeptical about reading that stuff back into Hegel. I think that basically there's a chapter in Give Them an Argument, the book, about this. A is A, Trotsky, Ayn Rand, and what logic isn't. Where I think that like what Hegel means when he uses terms like contradiction is just really importantly different from what terms like that mean when you talk about formal logic. So I'm a little skeptical, but I'll check it out. Oh yeah, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I didn't. I think I actually started to listen to that. I don't know. I got very far, but that's a good reminder. Let's see. 255 AD asks, Posadism is really silly, but do you think it'd be possible to just rebuild everything socialist from the ground up after something destroys society? Yeah. Maybe, probably not. Posada was the leader of the, so Trotsky in the late 30s tried to found his own international. There was the first international with Marx and Bakunin. There was the second international, which was roughly the social democratic one. Although lots of people who are revolutionary socialists, whatever, social democracy and revolutionary socialism sort of very gradually came apart, during the time the Second International existed. There was the Third International, which is the Communist International. And then after the Third International was taken over by Stalin, Trotsky tried to start his own international, the Fourth International, which never really got off the ground, was always a tiny, tiny fringe movement, not like the other three internationals. And it spouted like 100 different weird little offshoot Fourth Internationals. The most entertaining of which was led by this guy Posada, who was most famous for thinking that that UFOs and alien abductions were the Earth being visited by communist aliens. He reasoned that they had to have a very advanced socialist society to have intergalactic travel, and believing that like dolphins were telepathic, I think. Philosophize like this. I've listened to that. That's good. And also like being like weirdly enthusiastic about nuclear war. On the grounds, of course, the Armageddonist road to socialism is certainly exactly the opposite of what Marx thought, right? Marx thought that the possibility for socialism was created by industrial development, right? That's where all that good stuff about base and superstructure and all that stuff, like that's where it comes in. Again, read G.A. Cohen, Marx's Theory of History, and so first you have to have capitalism coming out of feudalism and sort of building up the industrial machine to the point where you've got this giant working class whose interest is served by creating economic democracy, socialism, fighting against the capitalist class, that. And so if the effect of nuclear Armageddon was to like wipe out that technological progress, then certainly from a classical Marxist perspective, that would eliminate the possibility of socialism. I don't know if I'd be, again, it depends on just how much was wiped out, but I think that I'd be very worried about the opposite of what Posada thought in that scenario, that it would like set the clock back by like centuries. That's so. Ekin says a lot of folks disregard Robert Brandom as just a liberal like Rorty, but Rorty was not some liberal. He was raised among Trotskyites and was a Marxist. Brandom's very interesting. Yeah, I remember Richard Rorty has an essay. It's in he has this like multi-volume thing, collections of essays, and whichever one of which has the stuff that he wrote about political philosophy in it. It was Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, maybe, I don't know, whatever it's called. There's an essay in there with some title like Trotsky and Butterflies. I'm sure I'm butchering that a little bit, but where he talks about that, being raised among like the Trotskyist faction of the Socialist Party in New York in the 30s. And it's a really fun essay, the way he sort of ruefully thinks about how he vaguely assumed at that point in his life that the mean kids who bullied him at school, that like the school bullies would somehow wither away under socialism. And I often think about that, when I think about the sort of more like utopian projections for like all the things that some people think will wither away under socialism. Um, or even the idea that like we can completely get rid of a state because like we won't have political conflict anymore. And I always think, well, like hell we can't, right? We won't, right? Like you're gonna have political conflict as long as you have human beings. It just doesn't have to be tied to poverty and misery and class conflict. Ooh, that's a good question. 255 AD says, I found an alternate history timeline on Reddit where Reagan wins in 76. Right, that's when he challenged Ford. It was a really good book by Rick Perlstein, The Invisible Bridge, the fall of Nixon and the rise of Reagan, where he gets into this primary, and then he loses to Hart in 80. Do you think a Democratic administration would have been any less shitty on HIV? I don't know. Maybe not. I really don't have a take on that, but I could. Unfortunately, I find it very easy to imagine a Democratic administration being very awful during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. Let's see. What should the left be doing to address the fast approaching zero emissions deadline? Well, again, I think the basic strategy, as much as we might be losing the rhetorical war on this, I think the basic strategy of like using the phrase the Green New Deal makes a lot of sense to me, that like sort of tying in as closely as we possibly can the decarbonization stuff with economic leftism actually has potential to be wildly popular. Because if you try to, to say, oh, we're going to have to do all this really extreme, carbonization stuff, but you package that as like eco austerity, like something you're doing on the backs of the working class, above and beyond the morality of it, it's just not politically tenable. That's how you get yield vests, right? Like in France. And I see back earlier in the chat where that question was asked, somebody says Kant is dry, but I don't think he's a bad writer. I think he has his moments as a writer. Some of it almost seems to be written to be intentionally obscure, I've got to say, although there's a really funny passage in Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals where he sort of which is actually one of his better lines, where he seems to be justifying his writing style, where he says that, look, philosophical popularization is a valuable thing, but you have to start with like the really rigorous unpacking of what the right view is, or else the popularization is just coffee house chatter, which I've actually quoted on syllabi before. Hey, I know the readings are hard, but do you want me to just feed you coffee house chatter? Let's see. Yeah, I think I agree with that, right? Hadid says, I think this is on the nuclear Armageddon socialism question. I think if a madness happened, survivors would have a dog-eat-dog mentality, just like all the movies, because that's all that people can imagine. Well, look, I mean, I think certainly if we're going to be materialists about this, I don't think you would expect that sort of massive social breakdown to lead to more positive pro-social behavior. Civilization is a good thing. I have not read the Searle Derrida book. That's a that's a fun idea though, right? So I know John Searle is a famous analytic philosopher. He's best known for the Chinese room thought experiment, which is supposed to disprove the idea of strong artificial intelligence. I'm not really convinced that it does, but whatever, topic for another time maybe. He did a debate with Jacques Derrida, where he said that Derrida is the kind of thing that gives bullshit a bad name, which whatever you think of Derrida is at least a very funny line. I would totally debate Thomas Sowell. Better writer, Ben Franklin or Tom Paine? Well, I don't know, but I have a hard time not saying Tom Paine because, if nothing else, just out of political loyalty to his radical views. But he was a good writer. Let's see. Oh yeah, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. That's good stuff. It starts out a little dry, but it gets really good. All right. Hit me up with more. Got a few more minutes here. Answer some more questions. Yeah. Let's see, I answered the zero emissions thing. Yeah, agreed. The Walter Kaufman translations of Nietzsche are really good. Kaufman himself, I think, is a really interesting writer. He was all you know he yeah, I think he's worth reading. And actually, the first philosophy book that I ever read was Kaufman's anthology on existentialism. See, JC says Ben, go on Chapo. Hey, anytime. But at least Chapo's coming on me, right? So I've had Matt Crispin on the show twice, and Amber Frost is coming up episode after next, I think. Thought. Thoughts on Aquinas. So I don't know. I actually went to Aquinas College undergrad, although I was I was never a Catholic. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think Aquinas, there's some interesting stuff in there. I certainly I think it's interesting that he was less reactionary on abortion than contemporary Catholics. He didn't think that personhood started until quickening, which is quite a ways. I think that's like second trimester. Let's see. What do you? Could you potentially see a Giffen argument crossover with Novara Media in the UK? I think it would be interesting, especially in cancel culture stuff. Yeah, I mean, look, that would be an interesting conversation, actually. So Ash Sarkar, who is who does stuff with Novara, that panel that I did with Natalie Wynn and somebody else whose name I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten, at that festival in Poland on cancel culture. I think at one point they were trying to get Ash Sarkar for that. I don't know if she just couldn't make the time work, or she just wasn't interested. She wasn't interested, I should say. She's interesting. But yeah, sure. Happy to have that conversation. Thomas Kimbark asks, what do you think about the chances of a third party built explicitly as a workers' party? Well, I think the problem with that is not the workers' party part, it's the third party part. Which is just that the two-party system in the United States, I mean, this is a little bit of what I was, talking about with Matt Crispin at the end of that conversation I had with him the last time he was on the show. It's funny. Andy, J. Andrew World, the graphic designer for the show, is making it a joke in the chat about quickenings, pregnancy quickenings and the quickenings in Highlander. And man, I love that show. I spent so many hours watching the Highlander TV show. So yeah, look, I think that I've not seen the Kyle Kalinske thing about some. Yeah, can you give me a link to the article, because I just haven't seen this. So apparently there's some article that argues the president can implement Medicare for all for executive order. That's an idea I have not heard before, but that's interesting. I'd like to hear more about it. But I think, but yeah, I think that the problem is the third party part, not the workers' party part. That's a little bit of what I was getting into it with Matt Crispin at the end of the interview when I interviewed him right after the election. And because I think at this point he maybe is on the train of thinking that, like, you just can't do anything through the Democratic Party, and I see why, right? But the problem is that the two-party system in the United States is incredibly resilient. It's so deeply entrenched, and so that's not to say that there couldn't be a new major party. But I think we just have to think a little bit harder about how it could come about, right? Like what that process could possibly look like. So I think that the one thing that I don't believe could happen, right? That I just don't think. Yeah, why does Canada have multiple parties when we can't? Because it's a totally different electoral system. So they like that's. Canada is like a regular parliamentary democracy. They don't have the weird, embarrassing, anachronistic, anti-democratic system that we have here. So yeah, exactly. I agree with what Yoda 7104 says in the chat. The problem is that that we can't Sorry, is the something in the chat? I'll get to that in a minute. But the problem is that because of America's political, like, electoral system, that's really it, right? The fact that that we have the sort of not only first past the post, which some parliamentary systems have, but in particular the way our presidential elections work, the way that we have all these kind of corrupt laws to protect the two-party system. I'm super skeptical about the idea that we could ever get a viable new major party by like running third-party candidates under, to just like, in hoping that they'd go from getting like 1% of the vote like Jill Stein. Howie Hawkins got a lot less than that, to 2% of the vote next time and 3% of the vote the time after that. And in like 50 years, they'll get 51% of the vote. I just don't think that could happen. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think we should be voluntarist about this. I don't think we should think that that's something we can just will into existence by wanting it bad enough. If we could, we would have done it already. I think that, exactly what Watson says in the chat, that I think that the only way we would get a new major electoral party that could actually compete seriously and win elections against Democrats and Republicans, which right now, I mean, it basically doesn't happen, right? That they're like Kshama Sawant is great in Seattle, but that's a nonpartisan office. And it's also significant that that's one of the biggest third-party breakthroughs of in decades, and that's to maybe since Bernie Sanders in Vermont, and that's for a city council seat, right? That tells you everything. So I think that the way I think that, again, if you could start winning elections, then sure, you could do some sort of coalition strategy. You could caucus with the Democrats like Bernie does, from getting elected in Vermont. I'm not against any of that. I'm just trying to think about what would be realistic, what we could actually do. And I think that having a new major party, like having a workers' party, there'd be a new major party. I don't think we can just will it into existence by wanting it bad enough. I think that has to come through like an organic historical process, like how the Whigs collapsed in the 19th century, and that collapse led to people who had been part of their anti-slavery wing uniting with various small parties and becoming the Republican Party and electing Abraham Lincoln. I think that's the kind of process that might actually happen. But unfortunately, you can't just will that into being. What you can do is build up social democratic forces, and socialist forces within the Democratic Party that if some sort of historical event like that ever happens, could become the forces that become that new workers' party. But I think it's just again, I know it's a less sexy answer. It's a less exciting strategy. I just think that's the one that could actually work. Right. Ranked choice voting would totally change this equation. But the problem is that to get ranked choice voting, you'd almost have to have the left, win an election and win a bunch of elections, which would basically mean taking over the Democratic Party and almost making the whole thing unimportant anyway. Although I still think it's something we should do if that ever happens. Yes, David Griscom for the Texas State Legislature. That would be amazing. I'm just thinking about the Molly Ivan stuff and like the 80s and 90s about the Texas State Legislature. Imagine David Griscom in that mix. I love it. Let's see. What do you think about the idea of just like going off and setting up our own communist society, the space colony? That's how Banks' culture started. So Ian Banks, who's a great writer, I love Ian Banks, has these novels, these science fiction novels, with something called The Culture, which is basically a advanced, like intergalactic, basically fully automated luxury communist civilization. I mean, I don't know. I'm very skeptical about anything that smacks of like separatism, trying to separate off from the existing society and like build socialism that way. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a dogmatic, Marxist in that way, at least in that dimension, I think you've got to take over the society that already exists. I don't think there's a plan B to class struggle. And in particular, I think that part of the problem with the space colonization thing is that's such an expensive, technologically intensive enterprise. You'd almost have to have taken over Earth society just to get that going. Not to mention that, I mean, like maybe we could colonize, the moon or colonize Mars, and then it would be, in the sense that we've colonized like Antarctica. We could have some like permanent research stations up there. But I don't know, certainly anytime soon, if we're going to do much more than that. Maybe I'm too pessimistic there. Yeah, so I mean, the point here is not workers of the world shrug. The point is just that we have to start from being realistic about the dismal position we're in and build from there. So I think that Bernie Sanders almost got the Democratic presidential nomination. He did the hat trick from Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. And even if nobody's in a position, to do quite, to fill that Bernie Sanders role in 2024, which, whatever. I mean, if he does it, then good on him. I'm all for it. I'm even if we have to prop him up like Weekend at Bernie's, but I don't think he will. And I don't know who else would do that. But like the basic underlying strategy, yeah, look, I mean, Cory Bush was just elected to Congress. I think, again, you could build up this like Bernie-cratic faction that maybe someday in the future could split from the Democrats and become its own party, if some weird process happened, like what, the collapse of the Whigs in the 19th century. But I think that an effective electoral strategy has to do that. Also, I think that we should be less focused probably the next few years on electoral politics and more focused on union politics, on rebuilding the labor movement and making it more militant and more democratic. And winning, getting, socialists, in positions of union leadership, because for one thing, I think that just has to be the base of any successful socialist strategy. And for another thing, I think that it would really change the game, even in terms of electoral strategy. Thank you. I saw it go by. I was talking about something else. I meant to go back to it and then I forgot. So thank you. Thank you so much for the reminder, Zelenki. So there's a super chat. Michael Tillotson, thank you so much, Michael, for the super chat. Says, thoughts on David Graeber? So David Graeber, like those, I have not read as much of Graeber as I should. That is definitely on the to-do list. But what I know about him and like the interviews and stuff I've seen with him, like when he was on Low Society podcast, I thought he was great. I think he seems like a really interesting thinker, right? And somebody who, even if I don't necessarily agree with him about everything, if nothing else, he describes himself as an anarchist. I think he's somebody who he strikes me as somebody who anybody who wants to think clearly and think hard about this stuff should read Graeber. I also remember seeing an appreciation of him in Jacobin after he died. That I thought, again, made Graeber seem like really interesting and somebody I should read much more of. I'm sorry, not a more in-depth answer, but there you have it. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so somebody says in the chat, all progressives that are elected turn into Pelosi lapdogs. I think that's overstated, but I think there's some truth to it. I think the problem is it's very hard if you just have a couple of people in there to really form like an alternative like pole of attraction, an alternative, power base, because it's such a like, it's sort of easy to forget, if you're constantly, if you're in this kind of left space where you're constantly reading things that you're constantly reading things about AOC or Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, Cory Bush now, Ayanna Pressley, I guess, although she seems a little bit different politically than the others. If you're constantly reading about these people and thinking about whatever sort of drama is going on between them and Pelosi, it's easy to forget that we're talking about a number of congresswomen, that you could count on your fingers, on the fingers of one hand out of hundreds of Democrats in Congress. It's a speck, right? It's a spec we could grow, but I mean, I'm not saying this to be an apologist for like everything AOC says. AOC certainly says stuff I disagree with, and there are certainly times that I wish they would be more oppositional to Pelosi and do more to differentiate themselves from the rest of the Democrats. But I also wouldn't expect miracles because they're starting from such a weak position. I think that we just, basically, I mean, I think that, could they be politically better? Yeah, they could. But I think that basically we just need to elect a whole fuck ton more of these people, before we can really expect that dynamic to change very much. Let's see. Other questions. Yeah, again, I don't think building separate little socialisms, I don't think that can be a viable strategy. That's part of the reason why, I'm even like, maybe this is a more unpopular answer, but when people talk a lot about mutual aid, like I'm not against doing things to help each other, where possible, survive the horrors of the system we've got. But I get a little antsy when I hear people talk about that as if it's something that's like part of some big political strategy, that we're somehow, that there's somehow some great political point to mutual aid, because at the end of the day, again, I'm not against charity. I think that it's a good thing. It's something people should do. But I also don't think we want to mistake charity with class struggle. Those are two very, very different projects. And so I think that, I don't think that mutual aid or like doing direct action with like tiny little collectives, affinity groups or whatever, or, having like little communes or collectives or any of these things, like basically when people misuse the phrase dual power, which historically means like, if you have like workers' councils that are actually an alternative source of government power, contending against the main capitalist government, like in Russia between the February and October revolutions, people misuse, call it dual power to mean this stuff that's basically separatism. I'm really not crazy about that. I mean, I think that my boring answer is that we really need to build up, like we really need to focus on workplace organizing, and then on whatever sort of electoral things can be done to build out of there and to try to contest, for power, even in a reformist way at first, within the existence of society. I think that's just got to be the strategy. See. Do you think the reliance on government assistance has diminished private charity? Well, the thing is, I don't think that private charity, like with or without government assistance, I don't think private charity was ever going to be equal to the task. Look, I mean, we can look at this historically. It's not like private charity was amazing back before we had a welfare state. And there's also a really important principle distinction between private charity and government, like welfare state programs, especially the kind of good Bernie-cratic universalist government programs. And I think that, and one of those differences, right? Because like if you're just purely thinking about, it's a little bit like, I was doing an email exchange today with a libertarian who will remain unnamed for the purpose of this anecdote about a possible in-person debate we might be doing next year. Right. And I was saying, look, I mean, I'm all for it. Right. I'd like to move it online if the COVID situation is still as bad as it is right now. But I'm all for it if we're all vaccinated by then. Sure. And this guy was said, oh, but like, only this, really, only this tiny percentage of people without comorbidities actually die of COVID. So, what are you so concerned about? It's like, well, no, dude, whether you die is not the only question, right? One, you could infect others, and they'll die, and two, there are a lot of bad consequences here other than death. So like permanent lung damage. So I think that there's something very similar here when you start thinking about private charity versus government assistance, because if the only question you're thinking about is like, do people starve to death, and can private charity, feed everybody so nobody starves to death, or if the only question you're thinking about is like the question that was asked to Ron Paul, right? There was this famous moment. It was not. There's this like really memorable, striking moment in, I think, the 2012 Republican debates when the moderator asked Ron Paul, "Hey, you're a libertarian. You're against government assistance. You don't want the government to be involved in healthcare. So what happens to somebody who's like a healthy working age guy who didn't bother to buy private health insurance, and he needs surgery and he can't afford it, right? What should happen to that guy?" Good question, right? And Ron Paul's answer was like, "Oh, in the old days we would have just like passed around a collection plate at the church. The church would have taken up a collection for him. That's how we would have handled it." And I think that there are a couple things wrong with that answer. The first is that just doesn't work, right? That people are in fact going to die if they don't have health insurance. So that happens all the time, even right now, when we're not living in the Ron Paul dystopia of zero government involvement in health insurance. Because like diabetics die because their insulin GoFundMes aren't fully funded in time. That happens. People who maybe would have gotten surgery and maybe even would have found a way to pay for it don't find out about their conditions until far too late, because they don't go to the doctor because they're worried about paying the copays. So you have something that could be something, could be nothing. You think, "Oh, it's probably nothing. And anyway, I can't afford to go to the doctor right now." That happens all the time. So I think that when the problem, so that's one problem with the Ron Paul answer. The second problem, which in some ways I think is even more fundamental, is that just like with COVID, it's not like how many people actually die should not be the only question. It's a very important question, but it's not the only question, right? There are lots of dangers of COVID besides actually dying of it. The same way, there are lots of dangers to living in a society that doesn't provide for healthcare as a universal positive social right through the government, besides just people dying because they don't get their surgery funded. So, for example, in a society without socialized healthcare, right, treated as a universal right, then you have things like people stay in jobs they hate because they're worried that if they quit, to find another job or train for a different career, they would lose their health insurance, or worse yet, their family would lose their health insurance. So that's a chain, right, tying people to their current jobs. There are people who stay in bad or even abusive marriages because they're worried about losing their spousal health insurance. So that's like one major problem that private charity can't solve. Another major problem that private charity can't solve is that it's degrading to have to ask for that kind of individual charity. Like, people shouldn't have to, even if we didn't live in a complex, cosmopolitan, pluralistic society, rather than like some little town in Texas when Ron Paul was growing up where everybody went to the same church, right? Even if there were lots of people who, don't go to a church or mosque or synagogue at all, who still deserve to have their medical needs funded, then it's still degrading to have to go to the church and beg for money a la carte to pay for your medical needs. It's degrading to have to go on GoFundMe, with the online begging plate so you can pay for your insulin if you're a diabetic. It's much more. It's much better for substantive freedom, right? For people to leave jobs, for people to leave marriages. And it's much better for just human dignity to have that be something that's impersonally administered as a universal positive social right. So yeah, I mean, private charity not only doesn't succeed even in the most obvious first order senses, and never has, even in societies that didn't have welfare states, but it can't succeed in doing in doing what public programs, universal public programs, can do. 55 AD asked, sorry, I think I saw this scrolling past a couple times. I didn't get to it. Even if it's possible to do Medicare for all by executive order, wouldn't the next Republican just rescind it, or would that plead political suicide at that point? Well, that kind of ties into the earlier question about what if, like, the Johnson administration had done Medicare for all, would it have survived Reagan? And on the one hand, I certainly agree that it's a danger of doing things by executive order, that that makes it easier for the next Republican president to just rescind it. We've seen plenty of examples of that, with Trump, rescinding Obama-era executive orders, and Obama never did anything that ambitious. But at the same time, I do think it depends how quickly the next Republican president came in. I think that's probably the best answer. Because I think if you had several years of Medicare for all existing, so people started to get used to it, then I think it would be political suicide to try to get rid of it. But I guess if like there was a president, President Sanders, if in the timeline where Bernie had won South Carolina, so he was becoming president right now, if a President Sanders did it by executive, like if you imagine like President Sanders trying to do it legislatively for years, and then somehow he finds this one neat trick that lets him do it by executive order, and he does it in like his last month in office or something, it hasn't fully gone into effect yet. The time President, Tom Cotton or whoever comes in, although I don't think that would happen in the scenario where Bernie was president, but whatever, like let's just say we get that scenario, then yeah, sure, President Cotton could just rescind it, and he could probably get away with that too. But I think if it existed for years and people got used to it, then yeah, I don't think, even if it was possible to do it and possible to rescind it as by executive order, I think that Republicans would make their peace with it, not because they liked it, but because they realized they politically had to, the same way Canadian conservatives made their peace with Canada's Medicare for all, or the way that British conservatives made their peace with the NHS. They try to undermine it in various ways, like introducing private contractors in parts of the system. But no Tory ever runs for office saying, oh, we're going to abolish the NHS, because they know it would be suicide. Let's see. Yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about with Destiny. So the second time I debated Destiny, the first one was much more polite, but then he started lying like crazy about what had happened. He wildly misrepresented it repeatedly, which he continues to do to this day. And so the second one was a lot less friendly, and that focused on rent control, and the idea, really what I think should happen, which is, yeah, we should absolutely have rent control, but that should be combined with a massive expansion of public housing, including normalizing public housing as an option for middle-class people. And this is something that came up in the debate. This is when he did his bizarre thing about denying, saying that, well, things are highly complex, then you can't use inference to the best explanation to try to figure them out, which is just like gobbledygook. So he said, so he was denying this idea that once you have universal social programs, so everybody benefits from them, or maybe very rich people would be better off without them, but almost everybody benefits from them, then it makes it very hard to take away. Because unlike means-tested programs, which there's always going to be some sort of cutoff point where people above the cutoff point, but not that far above the cutoff point, resent, oh, why should I have to pay for this stuff that I don't even get to benefit from? People think, often falsely, but they think that it's not for people like them, that they'll never need it. If you have universal programs like Medicare for All or an NHS or its equivalent in other areas, then yes, exactly. Homeless people exist because giving people houses is very complex. Anyway, enough about Destiny, but he was denying that premise that that universal programs are politically less vulnerable to the shifting winds of politics than means-tested programs. And there was a great moment because the debate was being moderated by my friend Lance from the Serfs, and who is Canadian, and so I use that example about how Canadian conservatives were against their universal Medicare program, when it was first being talked about, but now they have to say that they support it or they never win another election, and he was denying that. So I got to do the little Marshall McLuhan from Annie Hall moment and be like, hey, there's a Canadian here. Is what I just said true? But I don't know. Honestly, I think Danny is kind of a clown, and increasingly so as time goes by. I think talking incredibly fast, much as is the case with Little Ben Shapiro, impresses people a lot, but it shouldn't. And I think that he just ends up he just hates the left so much that he ends up in these debates where he has to deny extremely obvious things. And I don't know. The whole performance is increasingly sad, and I really mean that. I'm not being obnoxious when I say it. Let's see. Yeah. Look, people do complain about the fact they don't quite qualify for something, right? Maybe they wouldn't use that phrase just above, but people complain all the time, that there's some form of assistance they don't qualify. Talk to some middle-class parents, who are complaining about not, getting better financial aid for their kids for college. It's a very common kind of complaint. See, Watson says the National Citizens Coalition up here was set up by a private insurance weasel to attempt to deny Canadians universal health care in the mid-'60s. That sounds about right. International Bill of Rights, all for that. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, absolutely. I agree with Samuel Moyne that there's only so far that human rights discourse can get you, and that it's probably a mistake to try to just expand human rights language to cover everything. I think we just need to say, human rights are important, but there are there are these other kinds of rights that are also important, labor rights, crucially. And, you could say, labor rights are human rights or something. And I know what you mean, and I'm not against talking that way, but I think just strategically, I suspect that Moyne is probably right about this. I did a conversation with him about it for a Jacobin stay at home in the end of July, I think. Wow. Richard Linden says in 5 minutes, Destiny said no one cares about school shootings, which, all right. And that anyone who voted no on Prop 22 is an idiot. Wow. So, which is the funny, because sometimes Destiny talks as if he were basically just a social democrat whose only beef with socialists was about whether we need to go further than social democracy to, sort of try to start radically changing the foundations of the economy. But sometimes he, sometimes he talks like this, just horrendous neoliberal. Seriously, 22, basically going back to pre-New Deal labor law. This is something that, in any Hubert Humphrey era Democrat would have found horrifying, and rightly so. So, I'm just increasingly unimpressed by that dude. I completely agree. Hal 970FX says means testing was one of the levers that the ruling class used to destroy working class solidarity in America. I think that's totally right. Let's see other questions before I get off. Again, right? Canadian conservatives were against, what they just call Medicare, which is for all. They were against it when it was first being talked about, but they have to at least pretend to be for it now. And that's absolutely true too. Irene points out people can walk around with untreated infectious disease due to lack of medical care. It affects us all. Yeah, that's right. I think it's very important that people have a right to medical care even when it's not infectious, but it's absolutely true too. One of the problems with not having universal provision of healthcare is the same as one of the problems with not having universal provision of the fire department, that fires could expand from one house to another, which is sometimes something that right wingers will point out to try to say that those things aren't analogous, but it actually shows they are analogous, right? That's one of the reasons we need to have a public fire department. The fact that diseases spread is one of the reasons we need to have Universal healthcare. No doubt whatsoever. No doubt whatsoever about that. Let's see. That's a fun question. There's also one about analytic and continental philosophy at the very beginning that I never got to, so maybe I'll go back to that after this. But Oliver asks, which Kalam cosmological argument premise do you agree with? So let's see if I can do this in 2 minutes. The cosmological argument in simple form, that's also known as the first cause argument, that says, well, again, in its simplest form, it says everything has a cause, so the universe as a whole must have a cause, so there must be something outside of the universe as a whole which caused it, so that would be God. The best, of course, Bertrand Russell has a good line about this in his essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, where he compares this to the idea that the earth is on top of a giant turtle. And you say, well, what's the turtle on top of? Well, another turtle. This is a famous conversation that Darwin's Fred Huxley supposedly had with a woman after a lecture that he gave about evolution. And so he was like, okay, but what's under that turtle? And she says, oh, you can't fool me, Mr. Huxley. It's turtles all the way down. And it's kind of the same thing, because if you say, well, everything has a cause, as Russell points out in there, not only does that not get you where you want to go, to the conclusion that that God is the first cause of everything, it actually contradicts that conclusion, because if God is the first cause of everything, well, a first cause is by definition an uncaused cause. So that doesn't work. So the Kalam cosmological argument is a variation on the cosmological argument that comes out of medieval Islamic philosophers. It was taken up in the late 20th century and kind of dusted off and reformulated by a Christian philosopher named William Lane Craig, who had many crazy views, even kind of like justifying like the genocide of Canaanites and the Amalekites in the Bible. But as a smart guy, completely creamed Christopher Hitchens in their debate, if we're going to be objective about that. And the Kalam cosmological argument says, okay, well, we can't say everything needs to have a cause, because then God would need a cause and, defeats the whole enterprise. We could say everything but God needs to have a cause, but, that's just obviously special pleading. That's not going to convince anybody. So you need to say everything that blank has a cause and make sure it's broad enough that it sounds like it's a principle that, somebody like me won't just immediately say, yeah, it's just obviously wrong. Like somebody like me won't just roll their eyes and say, yeah, that like you're just gerrymandering, right? Like tried to artificially exclude things from the borders of things that need causes. But is still narrow enough to exclude God. So the Kalam cosmological argument, the answer is actually very clever to this problem, which is to say that everything that has a beginning needs a cause. Okay, that's pretty plausible actually, because sure, anything, if I say, like this coffee cup, right? I wouldn't say, oh, this came into existence without a cause, or if I did, you'd think I lost my mind. And certainly if another coffee cup that looked just like it just materialized into existence in my other hand, you would be very surprised. You don't think that's how reality works. You'd think something was going on here that you didn't understand. You wouldn't accept it as an explanation to just say, no, sometimes things just start to exist with no cause. So whereas like the number 3 doesn't seem like the right kind of thing to need a cause. It seems plausible to say that if there's some sense in which the number 3 exists independently of human minds, that surely it's just, like, well, 1, surely it's always existed, and 2, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would have a cause of its existence. You say, why does the number 3 exist? That sounds like a slightly confused question. So far, so good. So the Kalam cosmological argument says, well, the universe begins to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence, so the universe as a whole has a cause of its existence. Now, there's still a logical leap from there to God as the first cause of everything, and what Craig says on this is very unconvincing. Like if you read, there's a collection of essays back and forth between him and my teacher at Western Michigan when I was getting my master's degree, Quentin Smith. I did an independent study with Quentin on this my last semester, called Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. And the stuff that Craig says to try to get from something caused the universe to the all-powerful, all-benevolent God of, Christianity was the first cause of the universe. Like, his attempt to bridge that gap is very unconvincing, but let's even ignore that, right? So fine. If everything that has a beginning has a cause, the universe as a whole has a beginning. Okay, well, let's think about that second premise. Why should we believe that the universe as a whole has a beginning of its existence? Thank you for the super chat, Yoda 7104. Yoda says, my understanding of electrons is that they're threes. There we go. Yeah, this is already way more than 2 minutes. I failed in my attempt to hold it down to 2 minutes. In fact, it's probably going to be at least 2 minutes more. My apologies. I don't know how to make this faster. In any case, all right. So why should we think that the universe as a whole has a cause? Well, one of Craig's attempts to answer that question is to appeal to Big Bang cosmology, but Big Bang cosmology isn't going to really answer this because there are so many different views that physicists have about what happens before the Big Bang, right? Is our Big Bang the first bang? Is there a cycle of big bangs and big crunches? So every big crunch becomes the new Big Bang of the next universe. Is there some sort of bubble universe picture we should have, like some physicists say, that would be much more harder to wrap your mind around than what I just said? Right. So again, it's this stuff is incredibly speculative. It's very hard to test. It's not all clear that if, depending on what you mean by the universe as a whole, is there a multiverse, right? It's very hard to empirically show that, like, our universe is the beginning of the whole thing, and that's that. So then people start talking about using these kind of a priori arguments. And of course, the medieval Muslim philosophers who came up with the cosmological argument were certainly talking about those, because obviously they didn't know about Big Bang cosmology. And this was based on this kind of Aristotelian idea that there are actual infinities and potential infinities. A potential infinity is something that keeps growing and growing and growing forever, and it will never stop growing, but there's never a point where you like freeze frame and it's reached infinity. Like if you hear somebody counting 1, 2, 3, 4, well, if they kept counting forever, there would still never be a point where they reached infinity. That's not how it works. You can't go from a finite collection to an infinite collection by successive addition. So there's this Aristotelian tradition of saying, well, potential infinities are fine, but actual infinities are just kind of mathematical abstraction. You can't have one in the real world. And that's where they get to the universe must have a beginning. That if the universe had always existed, the span of its existence would have been an actual infinity. That's impossible because there are no actual infinities. Therefore, the universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Therefore, the universe as a whole has a cause. That's the move that they make. Why I don't think this argument works? Well, because ask yourself the same question about God. Did God begin to exist, or has God always existed? Well, if God began to exist, then he needs a cause of his existence. He's not the first cause. If God always existed, then the span of God's existence would be an actual infinity. You can try pulling the Augustine move and saying that God exists outside of time. It's very unclear to me what that actually means. I think the more you start thinking about that answer, I would argue the less convincing it gets, especially when you think about what that means about your theory of what time even is. So if you don't think that God exists outside of time dodge is going to work, then this seems like a real dilemma. Right? Well, if God's existence is either finite or infinite, either God has always existed, in which case that's impossible, according to the premise of the argument that actual infinities are impossible, or God needs a cause and can't be the first cause. So something which then this reasoning would get you an infinite series of gods, which is not only embarrassing if you want to be a monotheist, it's also a violation of the principle that there are no actual infinities. So I don't think that works. So what's gone wrong? What's the wrong premise? I think the wrong premise is there can't be any actual infinities in the real world. The reasons that people like Craig give for thinking there can't be any actual infinities are things like imagine an infinite library where every other book is red, every other book is black, red book, black book into infinity. Well, check out one of the red books. You still have as many books as you had. In fact, check out all the red books. They're just blank spaces between the black books, and you still have just as many books as you had before. But that's wildly counterintuitive that quantities, like physical quantities, could work that way, that you take away every other member and that doesn't change the quantity. Craig thinks this is a paradox. I just think that it's a sign that our brains didn't evolve to deal with infinite quantities. They evolved to deal with finite quantities. So we find the properties of infinite collections incredibly counterintuitive. The same thing for Hilbert's Hotel, which I'm not going to try to do on stream, but I'd answer the same way there. So long-winded answer to Oliver's question, but that would be my answer. I think the premise that seems dubious to me is that you can't have actual infinities. All right. Yeah. Let's see. All right. That's probably a longer digression into pretty esoteric philosophy stuff than people were expecting. If you want to get back to politics with the last few questions, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, fine. Okay, well, just to stick with philosophy of religion for a minute, I'm very unconvinced by the fine-tuning stuff too. I think that if it's one thing to say, oh, it's amazing, if things had been just slightly off, we wouldn't exist. But especially if you're a dualist, which most theists are, right? They think that like souls are separate things from, aren't physical things at all. Then look, my buddy Neil Sinababu points this out in a paper that if you're a dualist, then you really shouldn't believe in fine tuning. Because look, sure, if things had been just slightly different, we couldn't exist. But whatever. In the universe where things are slightly different, there are probably like sentient gas clouds or something marveling about how things were just slightly different. They couldn't exist. I just don't think that you can conclude very much from that. Let's see. Philosophy of law. I actually don't have any good ideas for that off the top of my head, particularly. Again, Judith Jarvis Thompson wrote about that. My teacher at the University of Miami, Susan Hawk, wrote about that, but I am not a big expert in that, so I really couldn't tell you. Yeah, well, look, whether the concept before the Big Bang, that I know there's that kind of positivist move of saying that's meaningless, but but it could be that the answer is before the Big Bang there was some other cycle of bangs and crunches. Again, maybe not, but it's very hard to rule out empirically or even to probabilistically decide which one is more likely or not empirically. Yeah, Lula Livre, absolutely. I will say actually on the subject of Lula, since the very first article that I wrote for TMBS was about Lula and Lava Jato, which is funny because there was a point when Michael was talking about it all the time, and like when we first started talking about it all the time, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm sure you're right, but like, come on, right? I need to hear about this much, and then he got me as obsessed with it as he was. And so I ended up, the first thing I wrote for Jacobin was about Lula and Lula being framed, and in that, it was a kind of a facetious way of framing it, but there's like a deadly serious point there. So the way it came about was Bhaskar Sankara and I were both guests on TMBS. That was the episode where there's that clip you may have seen of Michael. He's talking about astrology, and me and Bhaskar are pushing back, and he says, "Don't bring that nerd shit onto my show," which, goddamn. All right, not going to let myself get depressed about this on stream, but in any case, in between the main show and the post game, there was, we were just like, sitting there, drinking beer and talking, look, I'll do anything I possibly can to promote Left Reckoning, and I'm sure I'll be on it. Probably lots, he said arrogantly. But lots of crossover stuff, I'm sure. But we're, so Bhaskar and I were sitting there drinking beer in between the main show and the post game. And we were just talking about sports, and Deflategate came up, and I said, "Oh, actually, I think there's an interesting parallel between Deflategate and Lava Jato structurally." And he was like, "Hey, that sounds like an article to me. You should send it in." And then I did, and he liked it enough, and he read my book, and he offered me the job as a columnist. So that and actually also. One of the articles I co-wrote with Michael was about that too. It was Bernie has called to free Lula along with the rest of the Democratic field. I like that. Related to the previous subject, Pencil Polly says there's a wonderful creation story in the Upanishads where the void gets lonely and divides and ends up creating everything. That's yeah, I like that. But yeah, I tend to agree. The Irene says that stupid blood clot that Michael had disproves God's existence. I think that's a fairly horrifyingly vivid example of the problem of evil. Although Michael was a much more open-minded agnostic than I am. It kind of reminds me of Patton Oswalt talks about he and his previous wife, his late wife, used to argue about, religion, and, he wasn't exactly a theist, but he'd say, "Oh, don't you think it's possible there's some sort of cosmic rational order to everything?" And she would say, "No, it's just chaos." And then he says one day he won the argument in the worst, she won the argument in the worst possible way. But look, the reason to go on a show like Destinies is not to convince him. That's, you're barking up the wrong tree there if that's your goal. The reason is to persuade his massive audience. Look, I mean, I didn't debate Stefan fucking Molyneux because I thought that Molyneux was capable of thought. The point is that you're reaching people who might not otherwise be reached by leftist ideas. So anyway, yeah, one of the first article I think that I co-wrote with Michael was that Bernie has called to free Lula. Why won't the rest of the Democratic field? And then later, when Lula actually was free, there was a there was a picture. I don't know if he ever saw either of those articles. Well, maybe the Michael one because he did talk to Michael at the end. But anyway, there was a picture of Lula right after he got out of jail, reading the print issue of Jacobin. It just made me so goddamn happy to see. I can't tell you. But look, I don't think Biden is not going to be America's Lula. Get that idea out of your head. Biden is barely going to be America's Obama. I think there were real harm reduction and strategic reasons to go for Biden against Trump, if only to hit the sleep button on the worst Trump that might be coming along if the left doesn't get its act together. But I think that I think there's never been any reason to think that the Biden administration wasn't going to be an awful neoliberal centrist administration. No, I'm not worried about Molyneux reaching my audience. I think that it's a sign of the left not being nearly confident enough in itself if we're more worried about that than the other way around. And I think there are, and I'm not saying that just in a go team go way, mindless optimism. I think there are good reasons to think that we're more likely to reach their audience than they are to reach ours. For one thing, that our audience starts out being much more familiar with their ideas than theirs starts out being familiar with ours, because there are red diaper babies here and there, but hardly anybody is born as we did not know. Hardly, like, nobody emerges into the world as a socialist. Even if you are a red diaper baby, you're constantly exposed to pro-capitalist ideas, in education, in the culture, everywhere, right? So I'm much less worried about Molyneux convincing people to be to believe in the beauty of the free market, then I am optimistic that we can convince Molyneux listeners that there are good reasons to criticize capitalism. So yeah, I mean, he's certainly a world-class piece of shit and very stupid, but I still think he's worth arguing with, for the sake of whatever can be peeled off in his audience. Yeah, look, I mean, that's what Obama says in his book, that Lula was like a Tammany Hall boss. But remember, there's never actually been any serious evidence for that. And like even the extremely trivial corruption that he was accused of, taking that apartment, or whatever, taking that new home. There's never any direct evidence for that. I mean, like, look, maybe there are things for the sake of cutting certain deals to get important reform passed that we would consider to be corrupt that happened there. I don't think you can rule that out, but I also don't think we should just accept this narrative that Lula was super corrupt, without much more evidence for it. And also, frankly, even if he was, I mean, I agree with your larger point, right? Because even if he was, who gives a shit, right? Like, personal corruption is much less is relatively unimportant if you're passing a bunch of social democratic programs and lifting millions of people out of poverty and standing up to the U.S., in important ways. But I don't think, but I don't think actually much evidence for the personal corruption. I mean, there is a reason they had to frame him. Let's put it that way. All right, guys, I've got to cut it there for I said as with the thing yesterday, I said I'd be done at 7 for dinner. Obviously, not doing any sort of stream or anything tomorrow. It's Thanksgiving, but I am going to be back on Friday, and on Friday, we're going to be doing a rare 2-guest stream. One is Benjamin Blanchard. He's coming on at 5 to talk, that's Eastern time, to talk about an article he wrote for Current Affairs, just a kind of fun thing about like ants and, are ants socialists or ants fascists? It's, I mean, it's obviously a little goofy, but I think it should be a fun conversation. And then, so we're going to be doing that for half an hour. And then at 5:30, my friend and comrade and editor Doug Lane is coming on to talk about YouTube censorship and some Zero Book stuff that got censored by YouTube that was actually trying to debunk COVID conspiracy theories. So that should be an interesting conversation. And more good stuff coming out. But right now, I really do have to go. So thank all you guys for coming by, for the questions, for the super chats. Always really seriously appreciate it. Please like and subscribe. If you do have the $5, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you, Josh, for the super sticker. Help build this up. Help pay everybody who helps make this happen, a living wage. And even if you can't do that, please like and subscribe. Please rate and review, the podcast. All these things really do help. Happy Thanksgiving. Left is best. Come on, comrade.